I want to just go over a little bit. I want to go a little bit over we're going to talk about the oligopoly. Let's see, I'm trying to remember if we talked about this graphical analysis of monopolistic competition. I think I just started introducing this. So let me just start out by talking a little bit about this. The important thing to remember in monopolistic competition is that the firms do have market power. Let me just it's dark. Yeah, that's a little bit. The firms do have market power in monopolistic competition. So because they have market power, they face downward sloping demand curve. They face a downward sloping demand curve. So the dynamic of the firm within a monopolistic competition is downward sloping. And the thing here is that this, for example, here, this is monopolistic competition. There's spatial. There's some different. The firms are able to differentiate themselves in some kind of space. It could be physical space. It could be product space. But they're differentiating. They're making a differentiation. And so in that, there's some market power. That's the idea here. Is there's a spatial monopoly. There's some type of monopoly, but the monopoly doesn't extend. For example, firm 1 here, the monopoly doesn't extend to this square. This H4, it's only H1 and H2. They have a monopoly, and they're sharing the space with firm 3. So this is the idea that the firms have market power, and so when you have market power, firm has downward sloping demand curve. That's the important thing to remember about this. It's competition. But there's market power. So what we can see is that if the firm can earn, in this situation, the firm can earn profits. The firm can earn profits because the average total cost curve in the long run, as the average total cost curve comes below the demand curve. So there's some point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. And that would be marginal cost equals marginal revenue, say somewhere, probably right, it could be there. Marginal cost equal, let's see. Well, you'd have to find out where the market price is. But where marginal cost equals marginal revenue is that point on the curve where the firm is going to produce and try to earn some kind of profit. But what this is saying is that the firm has some reason to produce. So one of the things here, a firm comes in. For example, here there's a big area. There's big products. So this firm has a lot of has 3. So this firm controls three spaces. This firm controls 3. This space has no. Is not served. But this is saying there's a part of the market that's not served. It's like having stores. There's a convenience store serving that area, and there's a convenience store serving this area, but nobody is serving that area. So there's an opportunity to come in the market. A firm 3 comes in, and what happens? This is where there's a market entry. It reduces the territory by firms 1 and firm 2. So what the dynamic, you have this, firm can, you see that if a firm comes into the market, the dynamic is it's shifting the demand curve that the firm is facing. It's shifting the demand curve that the firm faces to the left because their demand shrinks. So look here, look at the previous page here, see that? Firm 3 comes in, firm 1 and firm 2, its market territory shrinks. So the market territory shrinks. It's the same, what it means is that the demand curve that the firm faces is shifting to the left. So if we go here, we can see that if that firm 3, this is firm 1 and firm 2, they have plenty of space, but firm 2 comes in, firm 3 comes in, and it's going to shift that demand curve to the left. So that's what firms can do. That with monopolistic competition, they have a monopoly in some limited area, but then firms can enter and squeeze out those profits. So if there's free market entry, if there is free entry, then firms are going to enter the market until all of that profit squeezes away. And what that means is that some type of market equilibrium, see there's the profit here. Let's say if you have a price that's there or marginal, well here is your marginal, and the other thing to remember is that because you have downward sloping you have downward sloping demand curve, you have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So your downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Whereas what's the marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive firm? It's flat. The market, a marginal revenue curve for a perfectly competitive firm is flat. This firm is competitive, firms get into the market, but they have some territory that they control. There's some space, there's some type of space where they have some kind of monopoly power, some market power. So because of that, they have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So they're going to set their marginal revenue equal marginal cost. So that would be here at 7 units, producing, so average cost here, this is producing this, so output of 7 and a market price of just about 8. So there's a market price of 8, average total cost of about 5.5, and that's profit. So as I say, then a firm can come in, that might be the situation, say that's being experienced there, and some firm comes into the market and squeezes those profits. The demand curve shifts to the left. That the firm faces, its market shrinks. Its demand curve shifts to the left, and in this case, your marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but it's a 0 profit. So in that case, the firm. So in an equilibrium where there's free market entry, in monopolistic competition, firms enter the market and to the point where profits are squeezed away. So you see here, you have the situation where there's 0 profit, but it looks completely different. Recall that for firms under perfect competition, with the flat marginal revenue curve, that the average cost equals marginal revenue looks like that. So your average total cost looks something like this. So you can see it's on a different point. The average that might come somewhere here in under perfect competition. So what that means is also under monopolistic competition, there's less production, the output is lower. So the firm is earning 0 where there's free market entry, the firm is earning 0 profit, but their output is lower for each firm than if they had perfect competition. So you can see it's on a different point. The average total cost curve, it's shifted to the left, and it's that point where, because it's a downward sloping marginal revenue curve, that it's that the point, and you'll see typically if your point of your equilibrium price looks something like this, then you have a situation where there's monopolistic competition. So just looking at the graph, you can get a sense of whether there's the monopolistic competition is present or not, because this point being here on the demand curve tells us that's the case. Whereas if it's perfect competition, it'll be somewhere over there, the firm would have a higher output. Let's see, I've told you, I've asked you to do field research. I really do want you to go out and walk around. I think it's very important in order to develop. Certainly, it's important to get economic theory, to understand theory, but it's important to be able to go out and see this in the real world. That's one of the things that this is. And I know there are mathematical economists, but really, if you're any kind of empirical economics or any type of analytical job, any kind of empirical economics, you really have to be able to go out into your market and see what's going out there in the real world. So what I'm asking here you to do here is to go out, and I want you to see these two different ways that the monopolistic competition works. That in this first way, I want you to see how these firms cluster, how they cluster together. That they cluster together because I gave you the example. I gave you the example that shows where there's a relative. Where the customers their demand is relatively inelastic over space, so they're willing to travel. They're willing to travel a distance and come and look. So you're going to get clustering. That's the clustering behavior here. So that's what I want you to look at here. And to do that, you just walk down the street. It's right here in Motesando. You can go to Shibuya. You were interested in restaurants or certain kinds of other shops. Again, you have many kinds of those kinds of shops. You can go to these areas, walk around, and observe the way the way it works out in the market. I also am asking you to do convenience stores, and because the convenience store has an entirely different dynamic. The convenience store. The demand for a convenience store is based on convenience. How far, that's why they call it a convenience store. It has to have access to the customer. So the customer is only willing to go so far, which means that that when you go out and you look at the behavior of the way that convenience stores located in space, they tend to avoid each other. So they tend to space evenly, to relatively evenly in space, relatively evenly. The world isn't perfect. There's places where they can't get into. But they'll tend to avoid each other. These firms tend to look for each other, to cluster together, because they know the behavior of the people that shop there are such of their elasticity of demand with respect to space is inelastic, so they're willing to travel a distance, and they're there to look. So they're willing to come to some central location and look at all of the and to go look at all of the shops and make their decision. Where here it's convenience, the stores avoid each other. So what I want you to do is go out and see how these things differ, in space. And you can see these behaviors and begin to understand what kinds of behaviors you have under monopolistic competition. As I say, this is very important because monopolistic competition is the most important. It's the kind of competition that we tend to encounter in everyday life. Everyday life, we tend to encounter this kind of competition. Now with that, and I'll be giving you some more exercises. We're coming up. Let's see. We're coming up. This is week 5. I typically give my midterm assessment. You were here last semester, so you know it's typically after week 8. So I think I'll do that. You'll have your tests. Most of your midterms will be like week 7. Is that true? Week 7 is I'll just announce we'll do it after week 8. If there's any, let me know if that if your tests if your tests are typically come in week 7. Let me know. But I'm planning to have the midterm assessment after week 8. I'll be giving you some exercise assignments to kind of start preparing you, kind of move you in the direction of some of the things that I'll want to assess you on in the midterm. So I'll be doing that over the next several weeks. Now we're going to talk. Today's lecture is going to focus on oligopolies. As I said, monopolistic competition is an important part. It's the most common kind of competition that we'll encounter in day-to-day life. But in many of the products that we may find, as particularly say if you go to a grocery store or some store like that, the producers of those goods quite often operate in what are called oligopolies. An oligopoly market, so that you could have, say, a competition, the competition itself in terms of the location of the store may be in monopolistic competition, but the competition that's within the store, the products within the store may be oligopoly competition. So oligopoly comes from it is a Greek word that means few. So monopoly means one firm. Monopolistic competition, we have many firms. There are a large number of firms. Under oligopoly, we have a few to as small as 2, which is a duopoly. So 2 is a duopoly. So this is for many of the products, manufactured products that we buy. You'll find that that's the structure of the industries that create those will tend to be oligopolies. So there's a few firms in the industry, each which has market power sufficient to influence market price by virtue of its size. In other words, there's a few firms, only a few firms. There's some competition, but there's some market power. So each firm has some ability to influence the price of the goods that they manufacture and produce. The products may be the same. They may be the same as in perfect competition or differentiated as in monopolistic competition. So they may sell the same product, but it's still they can still have some pricing power. And a very important point is the behavior of any one firm in the industry depends upon the behavior of the other firms in the industry. So one of the things that I wanted to introduce when I talked about natural monopolies is strategic behavior. We're very interested in when we're talking about firms with market power, we're very interested to think about strategic behavior. So what I'm going to introduce here later in this lecture is we're going to talk about some models of strategic behavior. I'm not so concerned about the specific models that you'll see as much as just to introduce students to the idea that there is strategic behavior and that you can model that. You've seen that with the natural monopolies, where one firm enters the market, another firm comes in and attempts to get market share, and at least in the model that I presented to you, because of the structure of that market, the first firm that entered the market was able to drive the second firm out of the market through strategic behavior. Here we're going to talk about strategic behavior. Again, what's important about strategic behavior, we're talking about games. The game thing, what we call game theory, and games, the kinds of behavior that captures the kind of behavior that typical firms engage in the market. So now we're going to make some very specific, discuss what we mean by the characteristics that we're talking about. When we're talking about size, what we mean when we're talking about size is we're talking about market share. Market share is simply the percentage share of total sales or other activity held by any one firm in the industry. So market share, it's a very important thing in an industry. It tells us how much control a firm has over the market. Of course, if it's a monopoly, then the monopolist has 100%. That's what a monopoly means. There's only one firm, and they have 100% market share. If we have a small number of firms, we're going to look and see what that is and how much share. We'll have some actual examples based on some real world and on a website that I'll have you look up. By few, we mean as small as 2, in which it's called a duopoly. Duo, that we have the English word duo, which means 2. Italian, it's due, which means 2 in uno, dos is Spanish. So that comes from Latin. It comes from Latin and Greek, but it means there's 2 firms. But typically, beyond that, we're usually reluctant to say exactly what it means when we talk about an oligopoly. Now, what I'm going to do here, and I've made my own definition, and that's, as I say, as an economist, there's no specific definition, so I've made my own definition, and the way that I'm going to define it is a maximum of 5 firms, each with a minimum market share of 5%, that collectively control at least 70% of the total market. So that what I'm going to say is that we're going to look around and we're going to look for examples where there are at least 5 firms in a market, where each firm has at least 5% market share, and that collectively those 5 firms control at least 70% of a market. So that if we have that, we will say, by that definition, I will say that industry has an oligopolistic structure. That it is an oligopoly. As you say, the goods may be very similar across an industry, even if it's an oligopoly. And you may have that, for example, firms that manufacture cement. Well, firms that you don't have many firms in a market, and yet they make very similar product. The product is very similar. It's cement. So like that, you may have what's called a homogeneous good. They're very similar across the industry. And at the other end of the scale are goods that are differentiated. They're different enough to be distinct, but similar enough to be seen as being in the same industry. Say cosmetics may be an example. Pharmaceuticals may be an example. There's differences. You can tell they're all cosmetics, that we may use cosmetics to enhance our appearance, but they're different products. They may be different products that appeal to different markets. When we say that the behavior of the firm depends upon the behavior of other firms, this is very important. And what that means, what we're saying is that each firm is aware of each of the other firms. This is very important, that each firm is aware of the presence of other firms in the industry. They know that the other firms are out there. They watch them. I assure you, if you have an industry that's an oligopoly, if you're a Toyota, you're paying a lot of attention to what Nissan, what Mitsubishi, what Ford, what your American competitors are doing, what your Korean competitors are doing, what your up-and-coming Chinese competitors are doing. You know what all of the competitors in the market that you're operating in, you're aware of what they're doing. You're aware of the goods that they sell, the prices that they sell them at. You're getting some sense of what their strategy is. you're developing your own strategy and the actions that you take in the market based in part on what they're doing. You may also, of course, you're going to make your own strategies. You're going to try to do something and force them to react to you. And of course, in the real world, the more that you can force people to react to you, you of course have an advantage. Forcing people to react is typically creates a strategic advantage. So, but each firm is aware. Firms may be leaders. That is, to be the first firm in the market to take action. And that's where I've just said a moment ago, if you have a firm that is forcing other firms to take action, those are leaders. That's a firm that you would call a leader. The followers are the firms that react to the action of leaders. Then there may also be, and this is a very important behavior that we see in industries, that firms may be colluders. They may work together. If they work together, then we say that their work together as if they're the same firm. Typically, collusion is illegal. It's a type of competition that is typically illegal. Regulators monitor the behavior of firms in the market to determine whether the behavior is within the law. Typically, in most market countries are unhappy to have firms collude. That's a behavior that has traditionally, in this country, it has been traditionally allowed to some degree, more so than in some other countries. I don't know what happened here. I think it was too long on the I think it was too long on the page. So that's also an important behavior. We want to see if firms collude, the kind of behavior that they make when they collude. In fact, we call collusion, we usually, the term an economist usually uses cartels. A cartel, and of course probably the best known cartel in the world is the oil cartel of OPEC. The oil producers cooperation. Literally, they cooperate. They collude, at least to some degree, to set market prices. So now, what I'm going to do, now in this section, I'm going to move on. We're going to talk about real industries. Real industries in this country. We're going to look at the way that firms compete in real industries. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, these are definitions, again, I've made them. They seem to make sense in the industries that I looked at, so that's where do they come from? Well, I made them up. That's what there's some general, but they're generally I think that most economists might look at this, okay, those make sense. Maybe they might do it a little bit different, but that's, there's a reason behind that. So what I've said is that if a firm has more than 50% market share in an industry, I say that it's dominant. You have more than half the market share, you're a dominant industry. That is a firm that you are dominating the market, you sell most of the product in that market, you have a big, when anybody goes out to buy products in the market, they're going to encounter your product more than any other product. They're going to see your product everywhere. That's dominance. That's a dominant. That's a firm that dominates its market. I'm saying that a major firm is one that's more than 33 and less than 50% market share. That's a significant firm. Any firm that has more than a third market share is pretty important, up to 50%. You can't miss a firm like that. It's pretty close to dominant, not quite, because if you're going to be dominant, we'll want you to have a majority of the share. But 33%, almost at 50%, that's very likely to be the most important firm in that market. A significant firm is a firm with at least 20% and less than 33% market share in an industry. Secondary, I say a firm with at least 10 and no more than 20%. And then minor firm, I say a firm between 5 and 10% market share in an industry. The other thing that this allows us to do, it allows us to say how important, or the kind of competition, the relative competition in an industry. If there's a dominant, does the firm have a dominant industry? Or does it have a major industry? Maybe it even has just a significant industry. If it's very fragmented, then maybe all of the firms are secondary. All the firms are in the market are secondary. So that's the degree of fragmentation or of market consolidation, depending upon moving from here, more consolidated market, and down, moving down, it's a more fragmented market, depending upon the nature of the market. So I'm going to classify also, so we classify by market share, we classify by product differentiation. So I'm going to classify, that's a measure. Product differentiation tells us how competitive the industry is. A pure oligopoly is an oligopolistic industry whose output has relatively little differentiation across firms. Those are typically produce goods that are inputs for other firms. So those are, there's not a lot, those are what we would call more basic industries. And I'm giving the examples there. Industries such as basic metals, and I mentioned cement earlier. This is a cement, again, another very good example of that. Basic industry, basic metals. Companies such as that. You may have seen this. There's been a scandal with Kobe, Kobelco, Kobe Steel. Is anybody following that? There's been anyway. That's an example of that's an oligopolistic. Right, it's a metals market. It's basic metals. They're doing. If you're following, that's certainly an example of an oligopoly in an industry where there's, well, relatively, it's actually, you could say, almost a mixture between pure oligopoly and differentiated, where the firm is trying to differentiate themselves by the different types of steel that it produces, but basically, this steel, it's somewhat similar. They produce steel. So that's probably, might be another example of a pure oligopoly. Differentiated oligopoly, whose output is differentiated across firms in the industry, but the goods are substitutes. And a great example of that, the handbag. So I gave you the example of handbags. The firms that make handbags, they're differentiated. There's all different kinds of handbags, but you can substitute. You can substitute the 4 million yen handbag for the Ichiman handbag, but the thing, so they are substitutes. Although, if you wanted to carry around the first, you probably would never carry around a lesser expensive bag. But but they are substitutes. So the degree of cooperation, that tells whether they behave, well, will they be, if it's cooperative oligopoly, members coordinate their activities, and we also call that, as I mentioned earlier, it's collusive behavior. They collude, they work together to set prices. Essentially operating as a monopoly. So that's the thing is that monopolistic, or an oligopolistic competition, you do have some competition, but if the firms collude and act as effectively as a single firm, then you're getting a situation where the firms are acting as if they're a monopoly. So that's called collusive behavior. Non-cooperative oligopoly, an oligopolistic industry whose members don't coordinate. They don't coordinate their activities, they monitor their activities, they respond, they act either as leaders or followers, or perhaps a little bit of both, but they don't coordinate their activities. They watch the other firms and act act accordingly. So what I'm going to do now is classify the Japan oligopoly industry by market share. I said I'll classify an industry as an oligopoly if the total market share held by the top 5 firms is at least 70%, with each of those 5 firms holding at least 5% market share. So I'm going to call a dominant, I've got a dominant duopoly. This is where we're going to talk about the number of firms. Typically, if you have, now it's easy to imagine, if a firm has 50%, more than 50% market share, and there's minimum 70% market share, well, the other firms can't have a very high market share. So you could have a duopoly or a very small number of firms, but it's an industry dominant duopoly where the dominant firm holds at least a 50% market share, where the top 2 firms hold a minimum 70% market share. That's kind of a duopoly. There may be other firms in the market, but it's really, there's only 2 firms that really matter. That's what we're, kind of industry there. Competitive duopoly, where the top 2 firms hold a minimum 70% market share, and where the market shares are approximately equal. So you could have that situation, where they have a high market share, and we'll see there's plenty of markets. There are definitely markets like that. Dominant major, I said holding at least 33% market share. Competitive major, where there's at least 2 firms with 33% market share. And again, obviously, if you have 2 firms with 33% market share, then the total market share can't be, the third firm probably doesn't have very high market share. So it's kind of almost like a duopoly. Competitive significant, I'm saying it's an industry where there's at least 2 firms holding 25% market share. Dominant significant, where 1 firm holds at least a 25% market share and other firms are smaller. Competitive oligopoly, no firm holds at least 25% market share, but all the firms have at least 5% market share, and the total market share is at least 70%. So what I've done, and I'm going to ask you to look at this site, and really, let me just confirm, I want to make sure that this fellow is still out there. I'm going to check on that. It's really a very nice blog. I suspect that it is. I check every year, and this fellow updates. They do updates. He's got very, very nice. It's fairly easy to navigate. He makes very clear graphs. I've actually, and I'll tell you, the pie charts that I'm presenting you, I just copied and pasted out of his, off of his website. So this is an example where I just paid, this is where the wonder of the internet is that you can copy. I copy and paste, and I of course give you credit to this person. And what I want to encourage you is to go to his website, tell him how wonderful he is. I told him about, I think a couple of years ago, I told him that I teach, that I use the material in the classroom. Didn't hear from him, but tell him that I don't know if he has many followers, but it's a very nice site. So if you're interested in the markets and Japanese companies and following them, this fellow does a very, very nice job of following them. And you go to this website. He does it in English and Japanese. So he really wants foreigners. It's one of these it's one of these sites where you see somebody that's putting their this information on the internet, and just really, I think, just for the satisfaction of just telling people about the Japanese market and competition in the Japanese market. So they say, I'm going to have some kind of things that I want you to look at, and I'll show you what I've done. For this presentation. I think it's underappreciated. I don't think as many people go. It's really well done. It's very, very easily digested. So let me go into it You will go to that site. And here's what he presents. It's very nicely, as I say, this is for 2014 to 2015. I think I'll have you, I'll check. I think he should have for through 2016. So you'll want to go and update. I'm going to ask you to update some of these charts and see how things have changed. So you can go to his charts and by year and monitor and see how markets are changing. You can see the dynamic, the ebb and flow, which companies are expanding, which ones are contracting, which markets are the sales contracting. And in fact, one of the things you'll see a lot, for a lot of markets, sales continue to fall. So you'll see falling sales in markets. It's a great tool. It's a great tool to really understand the dynamics of that. So let's just go. We're going to go to industry by industry and just see what's out there. I'm calling this a dominant duopoly. That is, yeah, I'm probably going to get back to bed when I get home. My daughter has been in bed, so it's. But at any rate, so we've got and these, you've got all these classifications. He's taken these. Most of this comes. He takes this stuff straight from the Nikkei Keizai Shinbun. So this is stuff that goes into the Keizai Shinbun, and he'll take like articles and then just take these market shares and just make pie charts out of it, and these oligopolies, and as I say, it's really great stuff. But so at any rate, so here is the Gyudon. This was the size of the market, 362 billion yen market. That's a pretty good sized market in U.S. dollars. That's about $3.5 billion market. That's a significant market. This Skia has so this more than 50% market share. Yoshinoya and 27 Matsuya, 21%. That is 79. That's 100%. So basically, they're saying that market is pretty much taken by just those three firms. At least those three firms that are listed. Well, what was interesting is that at least in 2014, 2015, is the market share or the total year on year in the industry was 3.9%. So you'll see this a lot. We've seen this a lot in recent years. A lot of these sectors, a lot of these industries are shrinking in size. As I say, the great thing about it is huge. We're going to see all kinds of industries here. Anything you can imagine, really. And the next one we're going to look at is internet video sites. And internet video sites, and this was 2 years ago. And this will be very interesting to see what YouTube had a 50% market share. Nico has had a 31% market share. You want to see? I'll be very interested to see. I think it would give you the opportunity to go look that up and see how that's changed between 2015 and 2016. As I say, Nico had a 31% market share, but still there's still like 19% market share. A lot of other little firms. There's 3 other firms there. And you might be more familiar with them than I know this one just because I get the ads for Nico. Of course, I use YouTube. YouTube is now one of the sites that I probably go to almost more than any other site. I'm on YouTube, at least watching videos. While I work, I'm just either listening to music or listening to some type of informational video. I spend a lot of time absorbing information off of YouTube. That's 50% market share. This is in Japan, so this is in Japan, 50% market share. Then we got the whiskey market. That's 138,000 kiloliters. That's 1,000 liters. So that would be 138 million liters of whiskey. That's about 1 liter per person per year. If you think about that, the average person consumes 1 liter of whiskey per year. how many liters of whiskey do you consume? I consume 0. Does anybody else consume whiskey on a regular basis? I can't, you know. So it tells you if the consumption of whiskey in this room might be 0, then that means somebody's out there consuming 4 liters a year. Once you get past 4 or 5 liters, that's pretty much you drinking it every day. So we're talking, there's somebody out there who's drinking a lot of this stuff. But anyway, Suntory is the big, that's 56%. It's a pretty good market share. The Nika Asahi, 28%. Kirin only has a 6% market share. This is probably foreign. I would think these are foreign whiskeys. So the Japanese whiskey manufacturers are pretty significant. They make a lot of whiskey in this market. So even though the foreign whiskeys are your that would be like your Scottish, English, Scottish whiskeys, but the Japanese whiskey producers are dominant in that market. So that's another thing. We can see the foreign penetration. We can see that foreign penetration internet video sites 50%. YouTube is of course owned by Google. We got inkjet printers. Inkjet printers. Here's where I say these are called what I call competitive duopolies. And these are some very interesting industries because some of these are very that you're very used to. Inkjet printers here's the interesting statistic here is there was year-on-year decline of 14%, and I put that in red. That's a dramatic, a market shrinking 14% in 1 year. People are just the use of these printers is changing very rapidly. More and more, there's less printing. People are printing less. So that's. But you only have 2. Canon at 45% and Epson at 42. They're the dominant. Brother, I think we have Brother at home. Do we have an Epson? I think we had a Brother. I'll have to check. But at any rate, I think at home I have Brother. But you can see, and again, these are. I think these are all Japanese firms. Epson's a Japanese firm. Yeah. HP is the only, I think it's the only firm. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think Epson's a Japanese firm. The Brother's Japanese, and of course Canon, very well-known Japanese firm. But that's a 4.8 million units were sold in 2015. But again, 2 very dominant firms, but a shrinking market. So these are 2 firms that are fighting over a shrinking market. That's not a place that you want to be in. If you're in the inkjet printer market and you work in that or in a company in the inkjet printer division, you're facing a lot of stress at your job. That's not a pleasant place to go to work at, I'm sure, these days. Internet portal, this is a very interesting one. Google at 41%, Yahoo at 46%. These would be accesses a month, and it's probably has to do with email. Of course, Yahoo has actually ceased to exist as an independent company. That was one of the great mismanaged companies in the tech industry. And by the way, if you follow these things, not that I pay close attention, but what was her name, Melissa Mayer, that guided Yahoo to disaster. She guided, I think she had 4 years. She ran the company and basically ran it into the ground and walked away with about $200 million. You know.
To work at home.
Isn't that wonderful? She worked at home, and the company went up. Basically, they sold out at a discount, but at least she made a couple $100 million. You know, wouldn't you like to run a company into the ground, work at home, and you get $200 million? I'd love to have that job. Lucky her. I think she had a kid. She had a baby too while she was running the company. But at any rate, that's probably for email, and that's interesting because that company has been bought out. Google, personally, I use Google for all my searches. My searches are almost all done on Google. Bing, does anybody use Bing, Microsoft? If you do, that's Microsoft's Bing. Somebody does. It's 8%. So maybe it's the Microsoft employees. I don't know, but that's 8%. And it might be people who use. It might be people who use Explorer that buy PCs, and since they use Explorer since it probably comes with the software, and then they use Bing because that comes with Explorer or whatever. That's probably that 8% share. But then the other's very low. The domestic it's a very low share by the domestic. Home game machines, and this is an interesting, I guess Microsoft hasn't had a lot of success in the home game machine market in Japan, almost zero. It's a little tiny slight. You can see it's less than 1%, though, less than half of 1%. Nintendo and Sony, a very fierce competition. It'd be nice to see what kind of numbers these are, and whether that's shrinking or expanding. He didn't have those figures, so we have to look and see that. If those figures exist, I always put those in here. The domestic air market. If you look at all these industries, it's just industries all over the place. This is what I call, again, competitive duopoly. That I say where two major firms control more than 70% of the market share, but they're within 15 percentage points of each other. So I call that quite competitive. And so the domestic air, you have JAL and ANA are quite competitive. Personally, over the years, I've always preferred ANA. I don't know if you've flown JAL to be as, and maybe they've improved. I know that they've gone through a lot of restructuring in recent years. JAL used to be owned by the Japanese government, had very close ties to the Japanese government, traditionally has. So that's kind of like a more bureaucratic company. ANA, a more private sector company. But there's more competition now. These are other competitors that have been introduced, allowed to compete in the market. I think that these two carriers had a bigger market share at one time. Now you have a bit more. It's still 74%, but 26% are other carriers. So that means there is some competition out there in the market. Then we have portable music players, and again, here's your crying tears. That's, there's a lot of tiers there, at a 10% year-on-year decline. Be interesting to see what, I'm sure that's if anything, that's probably accelerating the decline of portable music players. Everybody listens to it on their mobile phones now. Either that or on my, I listen on my computer. I do it on my computer. You probably listen to it on your mobile phone. So these are probably really shrinking market. And one of the interesting things here, you've got this company, Sony. Remember we saw Sony? Didn't we see Sony just a little bit ago? This is the kind of thing also, if you're analyzing markets, you want to look and see, like if you're going to be a market analyst, this is the kind of information that you'll want to know. Because are the firms competing in shrinking or expanding space? And in this case, if you're look at Sony, here they have 53% market share, but the market is shrinking at 10% a year. Probably, and I'll bet last year was even a bigger. I'll bet it's 15 to 20% decline. That would be interesting to see, but that would be my expectation. Was the decline was more than 10% last year. It's down to 2.2 million players. Sony 53%, Apple 38%. Apple's probably, I'm going to make a guess that they might have increased their market share. That's what I just to expect. But you're talking about a shrinking market. That's a space that in general firms don't want to be in, and we'll see that Sony's is a struggling company, that a lot of its products are in shrinking shrinking market, so that kind of tells you the company is struggling. Here's the beer market. This is not a growth industry. That's typically not a growth industry, but it's quite competitive. The two firms have 71%, so it just barely makes the 70%. It's almost more than that for the two firms, but I'm still calling that a duopoly. It's dominated by Kirin and Asahi, but significant competition from Suntory and Sapporo. Here's the Taki bean market. Very competitive, very dynamic market, growing market. Yamato and Sagawa, these are the big, the big competitors. Sagawa, the Nitsu, part of Nitsu, Yamato. That's 79%. Japan Post, the public sector, quasi-public sector competitor in that market. But the two big ones are your private sector, Yamato and Sagawa. And certainly this is such an important part of life in this country. And this is a very, very competitive industry, in terms of these, in terms of providing service. Very dynamic. It's growing because of the use of the internet, and certainly a lot of growth. And these are industries that have very extensive use of the internet. So, and I would think a very dynamic industry. Now we're going to move on to what I call dominant major oligopolies. And now we're going to see, one of the things is that Japan has had at least a reputation for being not terribly competitive markets, but really what you're going to see is there's a lot of competition out there. Most industries have, there's not monopolies. There's fairly vigorous competition in many of these industries. This is the instant ramen. This is only one firm. It's Nissin Foods has a 43% market share. But there's a lot of competition. There are five firms with at least 5% market share. The top two only have 65%. So you've got quite a bit of other firms out there. 5.4 billion packs of ramen. Now, how many people are there in this country? It's 126 million people. You can do the math. That's about 50 packs. What is that? 50 packs a person? 126. That's 1.2. Yeah, that's about 45 packs per person per year. So 45 packs per person per year. And I don't know, is that the individual packs or the, so at any rate, that's instant. That's instant. So that would be individual packs. So that's like the average consumes one pack of instant ramen every 10 days. Does anybody, how much instant ramen have people in this class consumed in the last month? Anybody consume more than 5 packs in the last month? The average would be about 3 packs a month. Well, that's somebody out there is consuming. This is, again, I don't think people are drinking a lot of whiskey. And if you're not drinking a lot of, if you're not consuming, he's not saying. But that's, so about one pack every 10 days. Let's see, yeah, about 1 pack every 10 days, roughly. Now, I consume 0 myself. I'm at the age where if I consume a lot of that, I'm going to look like I first did when I first started teaching here. I was probably about 25 kilos heavier than I am now when I first started teaching here. So I've lost a lot of weight over. And part of it is because I don't consume instant ramen. But at any rate, if you're younger, you can get away with that. But these are, in that mobile phone, now this is interesting. It's an interesting, is that the market is actually shrinking in mobile phones. And I wonder, maybe as people are keeping, I don't know, do people keep their phones more than one? Typically you get like a 2-year contract, isn't that? It's a 2-year contract. Now I'm on like, this is, and I know I'm going to admit this is like my 3rd or 4th year that I've owned this thing. You know, so but I think people they might be keeping their phones longer than they used to. So that might be why it's declining. Because certainly, I think they're talking. I don't think they're talking about this. I think they're just talking in general. I presume that that's iPhones. But of course, and it should be, because Apple has a 42% market share. So there's that big foreign firm. Lots of Japanese firms. Look at all this competition. A lot of competition. Got 4 firms that are within 9, 10, 11, and 13%. Very, very tight competition in the domestic market. Presumably these are like the Korean, South Korean firms that would make up that sector. But Apple, pretty dominant, 42%, far ahead of its competitors. So I call that a dominant major oligopoly. Here's tires. Tires, we've got Bridgestone, Sumitomo Rubber, pretty dominant. It's over 70%, but only one firm with at least Bridgestone with 45%. I don't have a car, so I don't really know. Anybody own a car? Does anybody care about tires? I don't know. Women's underwear, if you're, this is Wacol, has a 41%. This is an industry that is almost, it's not like, it's quite fragmented actually. You've got a lot of little firms. This is one that really, it almost doesn't really count as an oligopoly. This is one that's kind of on the board. It's kind of interesting because, and I would assume these were foreign competitors in the market. But you can see, once you get past a law call, you're talking a Triumph, which is certainly is pretty well known. Then I think these are all domestic companies. Pretty small shares in the market. So that really almost doesn't qualify as an oligopoly. Well, what's interesting, and what kind of makes it is because Wacol's market share is so high. So that's kind of an interesting industry. Now we'll move on to what I call dominant major. Continue on that. And again, we're going to see some sectors that are some shrinking sectors. Digital cameras. That's interesting. That's a declining sector. And again, it's if you pick up your phone, that's your camera now. Now, my 18-year-old daughter has all kinds of cameras, both digital cameras and film cameras. But she's an artist, so so people like that collect. She collects cameras. But I know she's able to collect them at the age of 18 because a lot of people are selling them, so they're pretty cheap. She's able to pick up cameras now pretty cheap. She actually picked up one recently that was, it turned out it was a Soviet camera, and it was a camera that I think was used in World War II as a sniper. A sniper. It was a very interesting. Maybe I'll bring it in sometime. You're interested in that stuff. But the digital camera market, very competitive. You can see there's only Canon, but it barely has 33% market share. So this is a pretty competitive industry. Nikon 22, Sony 11. But again, we're seeing shrinking market. And Olympus, Casio, very, very competitive market. Presumably the foreign competitors are there. One thing you can see in many of these markets, there's either a very significant foreign firm or not much foreign competition. That's something that you may have noticed. Flat screen TVs, another shrinking market. Sharp, 36%, again just over the 33% market, quite competitive. 17% Toshiba, Panasonic 23, Sony 11. percent. Blu-ray disc recorders is another shrinking market. Panasonic, this is another company that's not exactly thriving these days. Another company that has a lot of products in shrinking markets. So you can see that. There's Sony again. We're seeing Sony over and over again in these shrinking markets. Here's the energy drink, and well, we don't have Watanabe-san here today, who usually brings his Monster drink, and I know certainly watching him, you would think, I know a lot of people, you see maybe younger people are consuming a lot of Monster and Red Bull, and that's here, so that would be there. I don't know why they don't break that out, but most of it's still domestic, and with the Taisho, the one major. So I think it's kind of medicine, the little things. That's probably what most people are still drinking that as the energy drink rather than the foreign stuff with the more liquid stuff. Anyway, mirrorless cameras, another shrinking market. Canon, Nikon, kind of similar digit. Canon, Nikon, same thing. They're shrinking market. This one I think is interesting. Coffee shop. Starbucks, 42% market share. Pretty interesting. They really came in. I remember when they came in the market in the late 90s. Late 90s, they came into this market, and coffee shops were terrible. I know some people would say otherwise, but coffee shops were terrible. They were really mediocre. Most of the coffee shops were really mediocre. Starbucks came in and just blew the market away. They completely reconfigured the market. See, Tully's with 8%, so your foreign firms have had a 50% market share in 2015 and probably even higher than. That shows you the degree to which, this is for all of Japan. This is all of Japan. I think Tokyo is probably, Starbucks would have an even higher market share. Here's competitive significant, where one firm holds at least a 25% market share. Only one firm. Here we have NTT Docomo. This is where more than one firm has a 25% market share. So we have two firms here. The mobile carriers, NTT Docomo. It's all very, very competitive. Very, very competitive market. The three firms are the smallest are 27% market share. That's significant competition. That's definitely an oligopoly, but a competitive oligopoly. Washing machines, another one of these. Most of these are shrinking markets. It's just not. Japan is the population shrinking. It's not a great place to be a retailer or manufacturer. You're manufacturing products and retailing in shrinking markets. It's not a lot of fun. I can't remember the card GPS system. That's interesting. Why that would be declining. I would have thought that was growing, but now we've got what I call dominant significant. Only one firm has a 25% market share. We've got a real range here. We've got medicine, chocolate, personal computers, electronics, retail stores. The cold medicine, of course, this is a pretty competitive market. All you got to do is you just go to the store, any pharmacy, and there's lots of products. Lots and lots of products out there. And again, this barely even qualifies. And it's an oligopoly. It's got 73, these firms have a 73% market share. But it's a bit, it's a bit fragmented. Biggest industry is only 28%. Same thing with chocolate. Meiji, 26%. Latte, 21%. Morinaga, 9%. Again, quite fragmented. A fragmented market. Personal computers, another fragmented market. Look at that. Wouldn't you love to be in that market? 31% decline year on year in personal computers. I think that doesn't include laptops. I think that's desktops. I think they're talking about desktops there. Desktops are pretty cheap. they're kind of almost giving them away. The prices are reflecting the fact that that's your demand curves are shifting. That's shifting to the left, serious shifting to the left in your demand curve when you see something like that in 1 year. That's wow. So you got a brand name like Lenovo. That's quite a lot of shrinkage. 31%. If that continues, that would be like 7 or 8 million in, or maybe even 7 million last year. So it'd be interesting to see whether that continues. Electronics retail stores, very competitive. You'll see this is the retailing in this country. This kind of mass market retailing tends to be pretty competitive. Yamada Denki is 30%, but once you get below that, it's the biggest 15% Biku Kamada. These are all pretty similar, very competitive market. It's a lot of competition out there in the electronic retail stores. That probably tells you it's thin margins, very thin margins in an industry like that, with that kind of market structure. There's enough firms that you go out and shopping, there's lots of competition. So I'm sure that's going to reflect the fact that it's very low margins. We got printing paper, toothpaste. You would. It's interesting to note that the toothpaste. I would think, well, gee, you'd think you'd have a dominant industry in toothpaste, but because it's kind of like toothpaste is toothpaste, but I guess it's not. You know, for me, I don't know. Does anybody pay attention when they buy toothpaste? Because you do. Because I know that now for me, toothpaste is when I go to brush my teeth at night. My wife has bought toothpaste, and I don't, whatever is there, I use it. But I don't know. But somebody must pay attention because this is pretty competitive. People pay attention when they go and buy toothpaste because that's quite a competitive market. Lion only 29%, cow 21%. That's very competitive market. Here's one where then you're talking about where it's really not a very interesting market. Again, you have in the ad agency, and I put this up because this is kind of like quite fragmented market actually. Dentsu is your big firms, your big ad. If you're doing a lot of like TV advertising, big kind of advertising, Dentsu is very dominant. And all you got to do if you go, has anybody Dentsu's headquarters in Shiodome? Anybody know their headquarters building? They're like a 55-story building in Shiodome. It's a very interesting building, but the whole building, 55-story tower. So that's all one company that works in there. But that's only 25% market share. This is this fragmented, incredibly fragmented. And you know where you're going to find that? That's just right out the door here. Just go out the door and walk down the street. This right here in this area here. The little ad agencies are all over the place. Right. This is one of the centers. This is kind of the center here. Omotesando, Shibuya area here is kind of the center of the media and ad industry, that's. I'm trying to think of what else. I mean, you do have some other. You have the foreign ad agencies, but again, I don't think they're not as big as Dentsu. Soft drink, you can see very competitive. I think it's more competitive here than in the U.S. certainly. Coca-Cola 27%, but again, look at all that. Very competitive industry. 1.8 billion cases too. That's let's think about 1.8 billion. Actually, just look at that figure. 6 trillion. Yeah, that's 1% of GDP. It's pretty significant. 1% of GDP spent on advertising. Anyway, 1.8 billion cases. That's like about 15 cases of soda, of soft drinks a year. 15 cases times 24. That's 200. It's like almost can a day per person, can or pet bottle per person per every day. That's a lot of consumption. That's just to give you an idea. So to see how much people consume, we now have competitive. These are where no firm holds at least 25% market share. The other thing that you can do, you kind of see when you see this, you see kind of the nature of the industries, the kind of competition, the kind of product that they sell, like refrigerators. Lots of people, everybody can make refrigerators. Refrigerators now, there's lots of competition. It's a fairly ubiquitous product. You kind of just show up at some electronics store and you can buy a refrigerator. Look at that competition. Look at that. 23, 20, 18, 15, 9. That's very, very competitive. It's an oligopoly. It's certainly an oligopoly. There's only a few firms. Very, very competitive. Again, probably quite thin margins. It'd be interesting to see server computer. That's probably a shrinking market. Ham and sausage, and these are again very. Look at these. These are all very competitive. Look at how competitive all of these industries. Very small. Here's one that actually again almost doesn't qualify as a in the department store market. It's 6.1 trillion yen, but that's shrunk as over the years. But that is, again, the biggest firm is a 19% share. And that's one of the things you see in this country. This country is a very fragmented retailing sector. It's very fragmented. You'll see this in other sectors, like supermarkets as well, a very fragmented sector. I'm going through all of this because I want you to do something like this as an exercise. It'll be a very good exercise for you to get a good feel for the kind of real competition, the kind of competition that's out there in the real market. And as I say, I love this site. I actually put all this together in probably a couple of, maybe 2 hours. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you can really do. You can do a lot of work. We still have 10 minutes. People are walking by. We still have 10 minutes. You can learn a lot about a lot of sectors. This guy's a great guy. It's a great site. If you're interested in industries, in the competition in Japanese industrial competition, this is a great site to go to. Get. Supermarkets, I said the supermarkets, look at how there's no dominant, this is a fragmented industry, this is not an oligopoly. Remember I talked about Aeon? I talked about Aeon in my neighborhood store in the last lecture. That's the biggest retailer, the biggest supermarket retailer, and that's expanding 4.1%, so that's 19%, it's pretty significant, 20%, it's about 4% of GDP. So 4% of GDP is a big sector of GDP. Look at 70%. And you just walk around, yeah, you'll see Aeon. There's a lot of Aeons in Tokyo. But that's only a 12% market share. And as I say, it's easy to enter. There's a lot of firms out there. We had that firm, the new firm that came into our market, the discount firm. Really, it's a competitive market. That's very, very competitive, very thin margins. As I say, Aeon, you can see their strategy. They're trying to go where they can get some profit, in underserved markets. That's when you kind of look around, you see that's what they do. Very, very competitive. I wouldn't even call this is not an oligopoly. I wouldn't call that an oligopoly. So this is another thing you can look at that and see whether it's oligopoly. This is like a monopolistic competition. A market like that. It's not oligopoly. That's kind of a monopolistic competition. You start seeing this, you're starting to get towards kind of monopolistic, competitive market. This is kind of an oligopoly because it's 68% for these 5 firms. So that's kind of borderline. It's fragmented a bit because there's no firm with more than 25%. Competitive, a bit fragmented because there's a lot of other firms. Kind of borderline. International air cargo, again, I call it fragmented because it's less than 60%. Very competitive. These are freight forwarders. These are typically they can do the actual flying. It's freight forwarding and very, very competitive market. These would be the foreign firms. So foreign firms are going to have a big market share. That would be DHL, Federal Express, the other major American. So you've got those are the firms that are going to be there. Mobile virtual network operator, but that's internet stuff. As I say, the thing is, this is it's a very, very education. I think you really can you can educate yourself about the economy, the way the economy works very quickly just by going over that. So I'll have you do that. I'll have you put together some of that. And I think you'll learn a lot about industries, about how they compete, their market shares, where you think where firms look competitive, in general what's happening in industries. You'll get a good sense of that. So I'll be giving that to you as an exercise probably this week. I'll be giving you that. Now what we're going to talk about is, we're getting near the end of the lecture. I'm probably just going to introduce this. Now I'm going to talk, I've given you, we have 6 minutes. We've talked about some of the real world. So now what I want to do is give you some simple models just to think about how these firms, how we can model the way these firms compete. When you have, because the important thing to remember is when you have this kind of competition, when we're talking about monopolistic competition or perfect competition, this is not the way these firms compete. You don't, if you're using those models, it doesn't tell you anything about their behavior. You have to model it very differently. You have to model it with some type of approach that gives you some sense of strategic behavior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some duopoly models. These are some very classic models that have been used, that have been around a long time. In fact, this one, this is the Cournot duopoly model that this fellow, Anton Cournot, developed it in 1838, so it's been around a while. But what's very interesting is that this model is still used, economists still use these, which either says that economics hasn't changed, or that the modeling actually tells you something about the way real firms operate. These are, I'm going to introduce some very simple models just to get you used to, comfortable with the idea of these kinds of models. This was a very, Cournot was a French mathematician, very significant contributions to the field of economics, and particularly because he was a mathematician, he introduced mathematics into economics. So economics has had really, mathematical economics has been around a long time. So this was, he used mathematics to study supply and demand, and he was the first person to draw supply and demand curves on graphs. And he came up with this model of an oligopolistic competition, and called the Cournot duopoly model. And I'll just introduce this, and then we'll kind of close that here. And he has, in his model, they bottle natural spring water, picked a very simple product, sells the water in a local market. There's two firms. It's a competitive game, and they have the following features and rules. Actually, let me just think. The time I'm hearing some paper shuffling and along the way. And there's only 3 minutes to go. Let's stop here and we'll start up with this next time. We'll close here. But take a look at this. I think you have this, so I want you to please take a look. Let me just check and see how much more of this material we have. I think we're making good progress in the class. Yeah, we have quite a bit. Yeah, there's quite a bit of material. We'll spend a lot of the next class going over these. I'll certainly want you to spend some time. As I say, I think this is just for a very practical education, get you to use, also to introduce you to a website that will help you. A good place. It's one of the places out there that you can get quick data to learn. You put together all of these kinds of charts. Somebody says you want to do some presentation on competition in the Japanese market. You'll know where to go and where to put stuff together very quickly. So we'll close there, and well, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for your messages, your concern about my health. I'm hanging in there and was able to get through the lectures today. So there we are, and we'll close there. Thanks for coming.